Thank you. Thank you. Let me first of all say that I've been quite lucky with this book. Why? Because I've been thinking about this for at least 5 years, probably longer. And all the time I was thinking, there's something wrong with my argument, because you saw especially China going fast forward and even faster forward all the time. And so, like I said, I was going over my arguments and my reasoning again and again, because obviously something was wrong with the argument, because everybody was saying that the United States was going backwards or losing pole position, whereas everybody was also arguing that it was China taking over. I think you agree with me, or maybe you will not agree with me on a lot of issues, but you have to agree with me that in the last months, at least the perception about what's happening in China has changed. The invulnerable economy growing by 8%, 10%, 12% is gone. And it's my firm conviction that it's gone for good. It won't come back, growth rates of 10%. And actually, in the last months, after writing the book, because like I told you, I wrote the book a year ago, or I finished the book a year ago, I think my arguments are starting to fall in place more than I expected them to fall a year ago. Now, first of all, let's talk about American decline, because if you go into that, there's a whole literature about decline of the United States. It has been around all the time. For example, we have here Immanuel Kant, the famous philosopher, who once said of the United States, or of the Americans, that they are, and I quote, is there some more coming up? Because then I need a second chair. Thank you. Americans, so Kant said, are too weak for hard work, too indifferent to do anything carefully, and incapable of culture. Similar remarks were made by the two other gentlemen you see there, the famous Charles Darwin and the British, or the English, Irish poet Thomas More. These things, yeah. Okay. By the end of the day, Charles Dickens, the famous British writer, once said the following, I quote again, "If its individual citizens to a man are to be believed, the US always is depressed and always is stagnated, and always is at an alarming crisis and never was otherwise." 1805. Mr. Freud thought the United States to be, short but clear, a gigantic mistake. This one, Mr. Hitler, he referred several times in his writing and speaking to the United States, and once he said, "It's a weak country, incapable," I quote Mr. Hitler, "because of its racial mixture and feeble democratic government, of organizing and maintaining strong military forces." What is America, he continued, but millionaires, beauty queens, stupid records, and Hollywood? Another nice guy, Mr. Stalin, Soviet dictator in 1950, somewhat similar, not surprisingly, to Hitler. America's primary weapons are stockings, cigarettes, and other merchandise. They want to subjugate the world, yet they cannot subdue little Korea. Of course, this was the time of the Korean War. Another nice guy from that part of the world, Mr. Khrushchev, who in 1956, promised a collection of Western ambassadors that they would bury the Western world and certainly the United States, which did not happen, as all of us know. Mr. Carter, you also had some homegrown negativism, who several times said during his presidency that, and I quote, "the only trend for the country is downward." Mr. Kissinger, not exactly the same political angle, but for example, in 1965 he said, and I quote, "Only self-delusion can keep us from admitting our decline to ourselves," and he repeated that message several times in the years after. Mr. Prestovich, a high-ranking official in the Reagan administration, concluded that the United States was on its way in 1988 to quote, "a Japanese colony in the making." It's not 30 years ago. Mr. Kupchan, international politics, Georgetown University, wrote in 1992 an entire book about the end of the American era. More of them, for example, the German magazine Der Spiegel, weekly, much read. I've been in journalism myself. Every self-respecting non-German weekly has copyrights on Der Spiegel because it's highly respected in Europe. I'm going to take my book because this quote is a little bit longer. In 2010 they concluded that, and I quote, "the United States is dysfunctional. It is a confused and fearful country in 2010. The desperate states of America," not the United States, the desperate states of America, "are loud and distressed. The country has always been a little paranoid, but now it's also despondent, hopeless, and pessimistic." Der Spiegel, 2010. Mr. Summers, good old Larry, for us economists, he concluded in 2010, and I think it's a very nice quote to round up this very brief overview of declinism in the United States. I quote Summers, "American history has been a history of alarm and concern. Predictions of Americans' decline are as old as the Republic." And I think that summarizes it very well. And why do I think that this will not be true? As an economist, you wouldn't expect otherwise. My argument is based in economic analysis. And the basic concept for me is what I label in the book as turbo change. Change going faster and faster. And I'm not alone in referring to the change in the economy, which has already been quite rapid in the last years, the last decades, will become even much faster in the coming years and decades. I have Paul Romer, whom you see on the left for you, a sure bet for the Nobel Prize in Economics somewhere in the coming 5 years, who said a few years ago, I quote, "Possibilities do not merely add up, economic possibilities do not merely add up, they multiply," which is, of course, for the mathematicians amongst you, something different than just increase. Mr. Arthur, who is an engineer and a mathematician from the Santa Fe Institute in the middle, argued that, I quote, cumulative knowledge resulting in an increasing degree of technological advancement is the future. And then Mr. Morris, a historian from Stanford, a quite renowned historian from Stanford, saying social development has generally been increasing and has generally done so at an increasing rate. So that's my argument. We will see even more change, and change at an even more rapid pace than we've seen in the recent past. Turbo change will be driven by three things, actually by two things which are reinforced by the third. Human capital and knowledge combined with entrepreneurship. Human capital and knowledge are driving the modern economy. It's very important to grasp the fundamental difference between human capital and physical capital. Physical capital was, until a few decades ago, the driver of economic development. But human capital has two very specific characteristics. Human capital is non-exhaustible and non-excludable. If you build a factory to produce cars, you have a factory that will produce cars. If you want to change the nature, it will cost you, of that factory, it will cost you a lot of money. If your economy is driven by human capital, by new ideas, by further developments in knowledge, everybody can use it. If I use it, it doesn't exclude any of you to use the same knowledge. I'm patent issues leaving aside for the moment. And it's non-exhaustible. If an idea is used by 10 people, it's no problem for 1,000 others or 1,000,000 others to use it too. So that makes human capital very different from physical capital, which leads to the conclusion, and there is some economic research going on that clearly supports that hypothesis, that we will see increases in knowledge, in human capital, increase at an increasing rate. So a kind of exponential growth in knowledge and human capital. What is needed to bring about, on the basis of that development and to be expected development, a quickly and ever quickly changing economic landscape? Entrepreneurship. And not only entrepreneurship in this country or in my home country or in Europe or in Asia, indeed entrepreneurship worldwide. Older people like me still remember vividly the pre-fall of the Berlin Wall period, where when you looked at a world map, the areas in the world where entrepreneurial activity was in terms of economic development the norm were a minority. Today, the big exceptions are the countries where that is not the case. And so we now not only have entrepreneurial activity in the United States, North America, Europe, Western Europe, or some spots in Asia, we have it all over the place. Which means that a lot of ideas that are being developed, that are left on the sidewalks, for example, by the big multinational corporations, can be easily picked up, especially with everything we know now, or that we have at our disposal in terms of communication and internet-related possibilities. So the interaction of those two elements, worldwide entrepreneurship, of course helped by globalization, which also helps the development of human capital and knowledge. With that entrepreneurship, human capital, knowledge, mixing it all together leads you to a situation where you can expect a lot of change to be taken place in the coming future, or in the near future and the medium-term future, and even going on at an ever-increasing rate. The famous economist Schumpeter once noticed that it took almost 3 centuries to turn silk stockings, not the stockings Mr. Stalin was talking about, but that it took 3 centuries to turn silk stockings from a rarity reserved to queens and the likes of them into everybody luxury available for literally almost everybody. It took 2 decades for the mobile phone to go from toys for the rich, if I may put it that way, to real-life tools for more than 3/4 of the entire worldwide population. It took the telephone 70 years to reach half the American population. It took electricity 50 years to do that. It took the internet a decade. No doubt in my mind that this kind of fastness will get even faster in the future. Again, the marriage between human capital knowledge on the one hand and entrepreneurship on the other hand. So the next question is, of course, what does that mean, turbo change, for the economy but for society as a whole? It means a lot of stress, because it will mean continuous adjustment of your economic infrastructure. Jobs will be easily lost, a lot of jobs will be created, but a lot of jobs will disappear. Companies will come and go even faster than they have been going in the past. And turbo change in itself, apart from the strictly economic consequences, will be disturbing because of the environment in which it takes place. And for example, what we see and what we already saw with respect to the financial crisis of 2008, that kind of world can become very disturbing all of a sudden, and that it's a kind of binary situation where either you are in a smoothly running system or in a system going down the hill very quickly. Also, the abundance of information is a big issue, because part of the abundance of information is almost inevitably a scarcity of attention. It's very hard for all of us to make the distinction between bullshit information we get and the real hard, usable, underbuilt information. And so we have a lot of information, but we have to search all the time for what is solid information and what is not. All those elements make turbo change a very demanding evolution and a very stressful evolution for society as a whole. Going back to the drivers of turbo change, education, entrepreneurship, and globalization, I think I really don't need to discuss this in detail. I think the United States still holds very good cards on each of them. Maybe I would like to make one comment on education, because obviously there can be no discussion that the top universities in whatever field you're looking at are still in the United States. I don't have to give the names, but I think there's also something that is often forgotten in terms of, let's say, high school or related education. And actually I came across 2 years ago a very interesting piece of research done by Swedish economists and educational specialists, where the starting point was, is it correct to compare educational systems in a country like the United States, with all the diversity, all the migration that is going on all the time, legal and illegal, with a country like, for example, Denmark, which is of course a very homogeneous country by its nature and by the way the country has evolved over the centuries. And maybe some of you are familiar with the OECD PISA research, where they try to do a ranking on where high school education is best. And for years already, the Asian countries come out on top, then you have the European countries, and then you have the United States. Now, the Swedish researchers started to adjust these data for that diversity element. And when you do that, things change substantially. The Asians stay on top, the United States is closely behind, and the Europeans drop to third place. So even in terms of, I'm not saying there's nothing wrong with high school education in the United States. Probably there are a lot of problems, but I have the impression, and this I found very insightful research, there's a tendency to overdo it. That's my point. And in terms of entrepreneurship, I think there's a lot of things that can be told to support the idea that the United States is still, in terms of entrepreneurial attraction, the country amongst many others. Now,
you said a tendency to what?
To
in the U.S. there was a tendency to do what for high school education?
To conclude that you need to change it a lot to improve it. That's what I get from general reading about it. Now, the question then, of course, becomes, and this is maybe the core part of the book, why, in my opinion, is the United States best placed to deal with a situation that will be characterized by turbo change? Because that's the basic argument. My basic argument is, given the way in which the broad economic environment is evolving, given the fact that that will be an environment that will be changing at an ever-increasing rate, the United States holds the best cards to thrive in that kind of environment. You have a lot of literature on American exceptionalism. Like Barack Obama said, probably the Americans are exceptional, just like the British are probably exceptional, and maybe also the Greeks are exceptional. Not to say something about the Belgians, but I think that's not the issue. The issue is what is typical for the United States, and to what degree does that converge with what is demanded of a society to thrive in a turbo-changing environment, because it will be a very demanding environment. What is accepted today, what is the way in which the society goes about its things today, will be different tomorrow. And especially the ever-increasing rate of that change will be very demanding. And that's why I came up with the American character. And to be honest, I borrowed that from Mr. de Tocqueville, whom probably many of you know, although I think not in person, who wrote a famous, massive book on democracy in America, still highly readable and recommendable. And he wrote the following thing in Democracy in America. De Tocqueville visited the United States, by the way, in the 1830s for quite a long time. I quote, "The American has no time to tie himself to anything. He grows accustomed to nothing but change and concludes by viewing it as the natural state of man. He feels a need for it, even more, he loves it. For instability, instead of occurring to him in the forms of disasters, seem to give birth to nothing around him but wonders." I think that summarized it very well in the 1830s, and I think it's still summarizing it quite well today. Three elements I think are very important to understand that specific element, or that, for me, basic element of American character. And you see them outlined here. What I call the constitutional and the geographic starting point of the United States, leading easily to a quite general acceptance of a system of laissez-faire, free market economy. The Constitution of the United States was the first document that put the rights of the individual at the first place, second place, and third place. Things that one might label as constitutions before that always talked about the privileges of the sovereign or the monarch. And there were certainly attempts to do similar things, for example, in the UK, in Holland. But here they succeeded in doing this, and not only putting it in the constitution, but also modeling the institutions according to that principle, that cardinal principle of the American Constitution. The individual rights. The migrants came into the country, a lot of them came through the Great Mississippi Basin, very fertile country where they immediately, or almost immediately, felt that it worked. If you worked, it worked. And so there was an easy acceptance from the beginning from the principle of a free market economy based on that constitution and on the dominance of those individual rights. A second element of the American character is what I call, the migration issue. This country still today is a country that has a lot of migration, bringing in new people all of the time. There's of course a lot of discussion on that issue, but the basic element of a country of migration still is very much through, like Woodrow Wilson, whose picture you see there, said you have the migration is the constant and repeated rebirth of the country. I have to go back, sorry, to the first argument, because there you see, you probably recognize those two guys. On the left, Mr. Hamilton, and on the right, Mr. Jefferson. And I think that's another element of the constitutional setup of the United States, or maybe the more institutional setup, because here you have two people, two of the founding fathers, standing for a whole different point of view of society. Alexander Hamilton was the man with a more urban and expansive vision, strongly in favor of a strong central authority, a large military force, and a federal-driven industrial economy. Mr. Jefferson, on the other hand, had more rural, one could even say parochial vision of what a country and its society should be, with a weak center, a nation of farmers and local entrepreneurs. And with respect to foreign policy, I quote him, "Entangling alliances with none were necessary" for Mr. Jefferson. So two very different visions, and I think the United States has all the time profited from the fact that these two basic visions of what you do with your society, how you develop your economy, how you put in practice your foreign policy. And these two different visions have held each other in more or less equilibrium. And of course there were phases in the history where you had more one vision dominating and then the other, but always some kind of equilibrium came back. And I think that's also been very much part of that American character, of that very specific nature of society and the way in which it became organized. The third thing is what I call the frontier thing. You probably are all familiar with the writings about going west and pushing the frontier. That's the physical frontier, but there has also been the mental frontier, the scientific frontier, the research frontier, that especially since the Kennedy years has been very much been present. And if I compare that to the European experience, for example, we don't have a frontier thing. We don't think in that kind of terms. And I think although the physical frontier has been conquested, if I may put it that way, the mental frontier, developing knowledge and going after things we don't know or we don't yet know, is also very typical of that American character. America has issues, let there be no doubt about it. The political gridlock, the debt issue, the inequality. Briefly, with respect to the political gridlock, let me quote Joseph Nye from Harvard and a long time official in the Clinton administration. He says the following about the present political gridlock in the United States. It's a quote from him from 2 years ago. Nasty politics is nothing new. As John Adams, Alexander Hamilton, and Thomas Jefferson could attest. Part of the problem with assessing the current atmosphere is that the trust in government became abnormally high among the generation that survived the Depression and the Second World War. The country's past cultural battles over immigration, slavery, evolution, temperance, McCarthyism, and civil rights were arguably more serious than any of today's. A little bit of a perspective. I'll be talking about Europe later, where we also have some political issues. The debt issue is, of course, important, but let there be no mistake about it. If you look at the whole picture, not only government debt, also private debt, and you compare the United States with other countries, you're pretty mainstream. You're certainly not with the outliers, Japan, for example. You're not low, but if the United States has a debt issue, I incline to say that the whole world has a debt issue, which probably is true. Inequality is, of course, a major issue. Just one remark with respect to that. A lot of the research and a lot of the data that circulate in terms of quantifying inequality are talking about gross income, not after-tax income or after-transfer income, net income. If you do the exercises on net income, the picture changes. Not only for the United States, also for other countries. So I think the inequality problem is really an issue, but not that much as is often suggested by, for example, my good friend Joe Stiglitz. So who are the contenders of the United States? China and Europe. Some might think about Russia, but you all know that Russia is a hardly emerging economy, and it's hard to underpin a worldwide power with an economy that is basically producing oil, gas, and some other raw materials, and has nothing in terms of a real industrial or service economy. China is, of course, a very important country, will remain a very important country, but has a lot of problems. And what we saw in the last weeks is only the tip of the iceberg. The basic issue for me is the one on your left, what I call the confusion deal of Deng Xiaoping. What is not the confusing, the confusion deal that has been working quite well for China until now. We, the government, the Communist Party of China, provides growth, rising income and jobs, and you, the people, accept that there are strict limitations on your freedoms. Everybody has to admit that in terms of a deal, it worked quite well until now. The big question is what will happen if one of the two parts of the deal is no longer working, providing higher income, more jobs, and things like that, which is clearly the way China is going. Because don't underestimate the economic problems China is facing today. China today is the biggest bubble economy the world has ever known. What happened since 2008 is literally breathtaking. Debt, private and public. And when I talk about public debt, I talk about federal government and local government. Very important. Has, in terms of GDP, doubled in 7 years' time. We've never seen something like that before. It has doubled. Herb Stein, economic advisor to President Nixon, once said, if something cannot go on, it will stop. This will also stop. This will also stop. And China has the major disadvantage of having a lot of money. Because the first reaction, I'm talking from a European perspective, but in many other countries too, when you get into a situation like the Chinese economy today, your first reflex is always to throw money at the problem. And what is China's problem? This debt, this phenomenal increase in debt, is a financial problem, but that can be handled because of the gigantic international reserves China has. But that financial debt as a counterpart in the real economy. Factories, apartments, houses. I'm not going to give you any data, but the numbers that are circulating at the IMF, at the OECD, in terms of empty buildings, empty houses, empty apartments in China is mind-boggling. We're talking about millions and millions and millions. There is not one single industrial sector where China does not have huge overcapacity. I'm going to give you, it's on tape, so I'm not going to be too specific. I was visited by a Belgian businessman a few months ago, and he was, you must accept that I'm not going to even give you the sector in which he is, because it's a quite limited sector in terms of corporations working there. Anyway, a huge investment to do what they do. We're talking here about something like more than 200 million euros. And there were 7, 8 candidates, amongst which a factory in China. And after everything was passed on to the candidates, so he told me the Chinese manufacturer contacted him and said, name your price. I'll make it at any price because we need that order. If you say that kind of things, you are in big trouble. So that the financial debt can be managed easily. You just create 1 or 2 or 3 bad banks, you put in the bad debts, and there you go. But you cannot, unless you start to call in the military, you cannot let disappear the overcapacity in the economy, the overcapacity in the real estate sector. That you will have to deal with. And to deal with that, you need to be ready to accept huge job losses, huge depreciations on capital investment, and they won't do it because they have the money to postpone the day of reckoning. If you don't have the money, Iceland didn't have the money when the financial crisis erupted, so they had to accept all kind of nasty adjustments at short notice. China won't do that. China will buy time, like Japan tried to buy time in the 90s, and it took them 20 years. I think China will have its Chinese version of the Japanese experience. Apart from that major problem, the corruption, the pollution, the inequality issue, and then the strategic distrust. What do I mean by that? That is, of course, that we often, I don't know you guys here, but we often think about Asia in rather homogeneous terms, which is, of course, completely wrong. there is a very long history of very deep-seated mutual distrust between countries like China and India and Vietnam and the Philippines and Indonesia and Korea. And that makes life very difficult for the Chinese because, as you all know, a lot of these countries are, certainly in strategic military terms, are making good friends with the United States, which is a strategic problem for China, and I really have the impression that they do not know really very well how to deal with that. The other contender, Europe, and we're at the Eurocrisis now. The basic issue of Europe and the basic issue of the Eurocrisis is we need to accept that if we want to build Europe, we will have to let go substantial parts of our national sovereignty. I remember vividly when the discussions on the monetary union got going. It was the 90s. By the way, the birth of the European Monetary Union is the direct consequence of German unification. There's a lot of literature. Just read, for example, the memoirs of François Mitterrand, the French president at that time, of Margaret Thatcher, the British prime minister of that time. Those leaders were shocked by the fact that Germany, the Germany of the past century, again became one country. And some things we tend to forget quickly. The acceptance by the worldwide community of a unification of Germany was not that self-evident as we now think about it. President Bush accepted it, but had quite some implicit reservations about it. The big deal at that time was between Mitterrand and Helmut Kohl, who was Chancellor of Germany at that time. And I'm going to make it very, or should I say very simple. Mitterrand told Kohl, I will get the unification for you. I will use my substantial political and diplomatic influences to get the world accept the reunification of Germany. But you have to accept that Germany will lose its monetary independence. Because at that time, the early 90s, West Germany, the Bundesbank, the Deutsche Mark, were dominating Europe entirely. And if you want to understand the whole history of European unification, you always have to look at Germany and France. And for the French intellectual elite, never underestimate them. Europe, as always, and still is today, a vehicle to keep some kind of control of that much more powerful, much more economically strong country, Germany. And Kohl, when confronted with the deal Mitterrand was proposing, accepted. The people at the Bundesbank went through the roof. They never accepted the euro. Even today, in all frankness, they still do not accept what happened in those days. And so it was a political decision to start the monetary union, to replace the good old Belgian franc, the Dutch guilder, the French franc, the Italian lira, and all those currencies with the euro. The promoter of my PhD was at that time chef de cabinet of Mr. Jean-Luc Dehaene. Maybe the name rings a bell for some of you, a man who has been more than 10 years prime minister in Belgium. And at that time I was writing about the fact that the way in which we were constructing the monetary union was not good. Because if you want that monetary union to function, you really need to do the things in the right way and to organize yourself in a proper way, otherwise you will run into trouble. And all of a sudden I got Professor Nonneman, my PhD supervisor, on the phone. He said, Johan, come to the Prime Minister's office and explain him your monetary union argument. Now, De Hane had a reputation of being quite brutal, and if you were able to speak to him 3 minutes in a row, you were doing a very good job. Well, that time in my life I must have been doing a very good job, because he allowed me to speak for at least 7-8 minutes. And then he interrupted me and he said, well, that's the same story that I hear from your good friend here, Professor Nonneman. And the mistake you guys are making is that in Europe, when a crisis arises, we solve the crisis and we go forward. We cannot go forward without a crisis. If that is your hypothesis or the modus operandi, then you have the end of the discussion, because then he accepted my argument, or our argument, that the way in which we were organizing that monetary union would lead to trouble. But we cannot do what we have to do, he said to me. Now, we need a crisis to be able to do those things. That crisis, my dear public, started in 2008 and is still going on. My big surprise was that it took us almost 10 years before that crisis arrived, because in my mind, there is hardly a connection between the great financial crisis of 2007-2009 and the Eurocrisis. Even without that big financial blow-up, we would have had the Eurocrisis. Why? Because we built the house wrong. We did not foresee that in order for a monetary union to work, the members need to let go substantial part of their national sovereignty. If we don't do that, we will have one trouble spot after the other, Greece being the first one. And you see, Greece is 2% of the euro economy, 2%. With all due respect for the Greeks, hardly anything. We can get it solved. We did not solve it in 2009 or 10 or 11, and we did not solve it in the last month. The reason is that when you go bankrupt, which Greece did, of course you're entitled to support from your partners in a monetary union. But that support needs to be highly conditional. To put it a little bit more brutal, Athens should be ruled by Europe. That may sound very undemocratic, and I had huge discussions in the Belgian parliament where they say, how is it possible that the Euro group of ministers of finance does not accept the verdict of the Greek people that Syriza and Mr. Tsipras have the right to run the country? Well, indeed, I don't accept that. I don't accept that, because everybody who is making that argument is forgetting one thing. Greece is part of a monetary union, and monetary stability is a very important asset for any country. If you join a monetary union, you accept certain rules. And you don't have the right to go to elections to say, we will change those rules on our own, because obviously you cannot do that. So that's why I think it's very rightful and very correct that we didn't accept, which we explicitly said to Mr. Tsipras and especially to Mr. Varoufakis, we didn't accept the result of their elections. They could accept the results of their elections if they took their luggage and went out, which they didn't do. And so, with the crisis of 2011-2012, that's the time I wrote a book that Mr. Iglesias referred to, The End of the Euro. Why did I choose that title at that point in time? And I still stand firmly behind that title today as a Minister of Finance. There were two basic options late 2011, early 2012. First option, those responsible for the monetary union at that time kept hiding from the reality that the crisis that was going on at that point was not so much a Greek crisis, but an institutional crisis of the monetary union. And if they kept to that vision, the euro would literally have disappeared. And I can say to you that people who were at the table at that time confirmed to me personally the last months that, especially in March, April 2012, we were really less than an inch away from that conclusion. So that would have been literally the end of the euro. The second option was that we started to realize that indeed we were facing a very deep institutional crisis of the European Monetary Union. And that would mean that we had to rethink the whole issue. So that would also end the euro as it existed at that time in terms of the euro, the currency, and everything that goes along with it. So either way, it was the end of the euro as we knew it at that time. Luckily, those responsible politically and in the central bank realized that it was indeed a deep institutional crisis. We have made quite important reforms. We have made the European Banking Union, where now Europe and the European Central Bank is responsible for the supervision of the systemically important banks, which is a huge step forward. But we have to go further. You cannot have any kind of budget policy when you're part of a monetary union. You cannot have any kind of competitiveness policy when you're in a monetary union. So in all those respects, the countries part of the monetary union will have to accept sovereignty or loss of sovereignty. By the way, Italy, great country, famous history. You can summarize post-World War II economic policy of Italy in one sentence, even in a few words. You do a devaluation every 5 years. And then your economy gets fresh air, your companies can export again because the cost competitiveness disadvantage that you build up in the period before because of salary increases, because of taxation craziness, disappears to some extent. And then you go back to your old business, start to do the same salary agreements and the same tax increases and the same foolishness. And after a few years you're stuck, you devalue up and there you go again. Which is something you cannot do anymore in a monetary union. That's why the Italian economy for 10 years now is not growing anymore. 10 years. It's unbelievable for me or unimaginable that this can go on. Until now it goes on, but I mean not growing. So we need to change the rules, and the big question is whether we will accept that loss of sovereignty. I'm not really optimistic about that. I think there's a lot of, you see that also with the refugee crisis now, there's a lot of resistance to the principle of accepting that as a national country, as a national entity, you lose some of the privileges that you're so used to have. The major problem with respect to this is not Germany. From the discussions I gather that the Germans are quite prepared to take those steps. The big problem is France, who is not willing to accept at this point in time any further loss in national sovereignty. So that's why although I love Europe, and I will do everything in my limited power to try to change those things, but that's why I'm relatively pessimistic about Europe in terms of coming together. And obviously, if we as Europe want to be strong and want to be a real player on the world scene, we need to do it as a unified Europe, which we today are not, or to a too limited degree. So I think China has huge problems, Europe has huge problems, the United States has problems, but United States has intrinsically more tools or advantages than the other two major areas. And let me conclude by the following, just the raw numbers. For those of you who think that the United States and China are quite close to each other, and yes, for the economists among you, these are data in dollars. And a lot of economists will tell you, well, Mr. Van Overtveldt, what are you doing? You should translate that in purchasing power parity. You should adjust for what a dollar buys in China and what a dollar buys in the United States. I agree with that argument when you talk about GDP per capita, gross domestic product, what your economy represents. I do not agree with that argument for the economy as a whole. Why? Because a lot of what your economy can do or cannot do depends on having the currency available. All the oil trade, all the high-tech trade, all the international investment finance goes on in dollars. That's the currency. So if you compare economies on an economy-wide basis, you have to do it in the most important worldwide currency of the moment, which is, of course, still the dollar. And then you see that at the end of 2013, the Chinese economy was a little bit more than half the American economy. I don't know how you feel about coming close or being close. I think it's not that close. And you can start to do the math. Just imagine that China will keep on growing now by 7%. Which they will not be able to do, but just let's imagine. And that the United States will be growing by, let's say, 2 to 3%. It takes a huge number of years before this gap is closed. You can also deduct from these data that the American economy is still a class in its own. If you start to count up from the bottom, I think you have to take India, Russia, Italy, Brazil, the UK, France, and Germany, and then you more or less have the American economy. So that's why I really think that the 21st century, and that's my conclusion, Mr. Iglesias, will still economically and politically be dominated by the United States. Thank you very much.